we all were at one time. And what are we going to do next month? You know, and now it's as they get older, you think about the older people in your company. What are they thinking about? They're thinking about, well, how much longer can I be here and retire? When can I retire? So it's a whole different mindset, right? All right. All right, now this one's a little harder to read, but it says from family, subordinate. Now your teenagers are subordinates, right? They're supposed to do what you say. Okay, from family subordinate to peer. So now if they graduate from your household, they graduate from college, then they come back and they're more like peers. Is anybody there? Anybody experience that? Okay, they're more like peers, right? And so you would go places and do things. You might still support them a little bit, but sometimes they'll pay. You know, in the future, you look forward to that. They'll actually pay for the meal to a leader. Now, someday, they're going to make decisions based on where you're going to live. You know, if we live long enough, everything's happening the way that normally happens, and that's what happens. Now, the same thing happens in your company. So what this guy is saying is that often our company's designed to treat people as if they're infants. You know, we're telling people what to do, we're telling them how to do it, and everything else. And these same people have families they're making decisions for. They're making investments. They're building houses. They're doing all kinds of things that sometimes we forget that there's a maturity level that people grow into, right? Now, if we look at what your reading was on today, the situational leadership, that's the whole point behind situational leadership. This research was probably done before this research. So the people who wrote this had all this other research we've been talking about to draw on in order to make some of the conclusions. Does that make sense? So this is where some of that's coming from. Now, all right, let me stop this for a second and pull this box out of the way. And it says a lack of awareness of self to self-control. Does that make sense? It's kind of more of the same. All right, so now the next one is the same guy says that there is no comparison between classical management and normal behavior. Now, when he talks about classical management, what do you think he's talking about? Right, he's talking about kind of a bureaucratic, mechanistic, organizational structure or culture. So when we talk about mechanistic, we're talking about very hierarchical, very procedure policy oriented, very chain of command oriented, very mechanistic. Does that make sense? And the opposite of mechanistic is organic. Organic, you think of things growing and changing, and that's kind of what it sounds like, and it's kind of what it is. So mechanistic versus organic. Classical is more mechanistic in nature, more bureaucratic in nature. Now, you probably learned a little bit about Weber's bureaucracy, either in your reading. Is that right? A bureaucracy, where bureaucracies came from. Now think about it. Is bureaucracy a good thing or a bad thing? Yeah, it could be, either one. And it's exactly the right answer. And it depends on what the situation is. Because in the days that Weber designed this, what was going on is that you had a group of people across the U.S., for example, and most of them lived on farms. And most businesses were small mom-and-pop businesses. And then they grew into large mom-and-pop businesses, and the families owned them. And so to get into a position of power, what did you have to do? You had to be part of the family, or be liked by the family, or be chosen by the family, or something like that. And so it wasn't really based on what you knew, it was who you knew. And that's the way it was, right? And so now Weber's bureaucracy said something like, well, we got to figure out some way to get the idiot nephew out of becoming the president of the company. And I'm simplifying things, but can you imagine that thought process? Our company's going down. They're abusing people. And can you imagine all the abuse? In the worst case, can you imagine the abuse that goes on in a company today? Okay, can you imagine that abuse when there's no controls? You know, and that's what we're dealing with. So now, in the bureaucratic organization, as it was designed, is we have an office, and the office has power. For example, the president has a certain amount of power, the division manager has a certain amount of power, and all these offices have a certain amount of power, right? To get there, you have to have a certain expertise. This requires some expertise. Division manager requires some expertise, and their whatever business unit below that would require some kind of expertise, right? So now you have job descriptions in order to compete for those jobs. So do you think that changed the way a lot of companies did business? It did. Can you imagine that changed for the better? So, and can you imagine that other rules and regulations like child labor laws and how you treat women and races and different things like that, as that grew, those policies and procedures became more, but in the process of doing that, it becomes more mechanistic. Does that make sense? Because now you got to follow certain rules. So mechanistic organizational structures are not necessarily a bad thing. It's how it's applied and what time we're applying it and what the standard of society is and all these other things. Can you imagine that early on we needed more of that and now we might need less of that? Okay, so anyway, here's what, but there's some drawbacks. The more mechanistic you get in today's society, or in this case in 1987, and I think, I can't remember when Argus was, but the book was 1987. So can you imagine that a few years ago, when they started figuring this out, as people started understanding that you have to treat people like people, right? And as that's become more acceptable, then there's other things that are a problem, and that is normal growth patterns, normal maturity patterns.